Thank you to Angela for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming to this talk. So I've been working with posthumanism and new material feminist theories for a long time now. And about 8, or we think it might be 10 years ago, I did a conference symposium on posthumanism with Leslie Gourlay, whose research is on the connections between digital literacies and posthumanism. And she said then that she felt that her work, our work, was situated somewhere on the lunatic fringe. And we had a small but interested audience. We are now talking about posthumanism at the major European conference on educational research. So thank you to my colleagues in the Gender and Education Network, Andrea Abbas and Branislava Baranovic, for nominating me for this keynote, and to the Council for the invitation. And I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm cheered and heartened to see so many of us are now interested in, or at least curious about, alternative modes of theorizing and in the potential for thinking and doing education differently. So the title of my talk today is on the slide, and I'm intending to talk for about 45 minutes, with about 10 minutes at the end for questions. And my central line of argument is that posthumanism and new material feminism offer vital, creative, and necessary reformulations of educational research, curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment that can help us to produce new knowledge imaginaries for making educational institutions, schools, colleges, universities, and our practices more hospitable and hopeful places and spaces. So I'm happy for you to tweet about anything, or send an X, as it's now called, and my Twitter handle is here. But please, can I ask you not to individually tweet more than 1 or 2 slides? Thank you. So the presentation is being recorded and live streamed, and also will be available later. So just to kick us off, here is a working definition of posthumanism that can provide a grounding for the first part of the presentation. And I'll theoretically deepen and add to this later. But for those who are new to posthumanism, I thought it might help at this point in time. So, posthumanism, new material feminism, is a heterogeneous constellation of ideas, concepts, theories, and practices. And it includes, but is not limited to, everything that's here on the slide. And I'm not going to read the list out, because you can read it more quickly than I can say it. But you can see that there is a lot going on here. This is a very diverse field, and there are productive tensions, differences, and disputes within and across the field. So for that reason, it's important that those using posthumanism, I think, are quite precise in defining their theoretical orientation, epistemological location, and ontological positionality. So with that in mind, it's important, I will do that to tell you about my take on posthumanism. So posthumanism does not mean after the human, but aims to decenter the human by putting the human in relation, to include the missing peoples, animals, non-human kin, and the natural world. So posthumanism is an entangled theory, methodology, and praxis. And the praxis is important because I think posthumanism is a political stance of feminist indiscipline which aims to keep knowledge in motion. And that produces methodology as a creative practice. So methods are not something to be taken off the shelf, such as an interview or a focus group or a questionnaire. But methods are things that need to be devised anew for each new research inquiry. And this makes methodology a practice of experimentation, a practice of what happens if. So I believe the classroom and all spaces of educative encounter remain spaces of possibility. And in this, I'm inspired by the hope, optimism, and love of Black feminist educator Bell Hooks. Education is a material practice, and education matters. Okay, so now we have our initial definition. This is what I'm going to be talking about. So my presentation today is in 5 parts. So I'll first briefly lay out some orientations in terms of social contexts and prevailing educational conditions that I think make posthumanism so needed. Then I'll discuss posthumanism in more detail, and then I'll turn briefly to some of the problems and critiques of posthumanism. And then in the 4th part, I'll focus on new knowledge, imaginaries, and posthumanist educational praxis. And I'll consider some of the work being done so far for rethinking and doing education differently, including examples from my own work. And I'll try to keep in mind in that talk the question of what practical difference I think posthumanism can make. And then in part 5, I'll pull it together with some concluding thoughts. So, orientations. You'll be familiar with most of these. The Anthropocene and the human-induced changes that we have brought to the ecology in terms of the destruction of the natural world. And that has produced a precarity of ecosystems arising from capitalism and white, Western, masculinist, colonialist progress narratives. And Anna Singh asks us, how might we engage in multi-species living, which is more productive and generative? So that's one context. Second one, COVID. Bruno Latour, in 2021, in After Lockdown, A Metamorphosis, ponders the consequences of the pandemic. In front of us, as behind, there's a sort of carapace of consequences, every day more appalling, that I have to learn to drag around. Will I finally wake from this nightmare and go back to what I was before? Free, whole, mobile, an old-fashioned human being, in short. So human action, it seems we now know, implicates us in shared fates of desperate vulnerability and fear. And despite politicians' moves to wipe away the pandemic in order to reinstate capitalist globalist imperatives, we seem to now have more of an inkling that we are compatriots, which is Latour's word, with other animals, bacteria, and organisms. And Donna Haraway argues that it's our connections, associations, overlappings, and combinations as terrans, which is her word for earthy and earthly creatures, that enable us to stay with the trouble of making the world habitable. So, what we know from the climate crisis and COVID-19 is that exposure and death and the fear and anguish of extinction are differentially distributed among humans and among the natural world. Okay, so another context, AI. We live in an age of electronic reason and computational media, says Mbembe in 2017, and our condition is algorithmic. UNESCO says that AI has the potential to address some of the biggest challenges, inform innovative teaching, support progress towards SDG 4 to ensure inclusive and equitable education, and promote lifelong learning. But AI brings risks and challenges which have outpaced policy and regulatory frameworks, and which threaten to widen technological divides between countries. And you'll know about chatbots like ChatGPT, which generate authoritative seeming responses using machine-produced content. And these, again, seem to reinstate certain kinds of hegemonic knowledges. They function, or may, as all-knowing oracles projecting certain worldviews, reinstating damaging forms of authority and objectivity. Closer to home, contemporary education. These are some of the characteristics that underpin much of mainstream educational research, pedagogy, and assessment. And when I see these words and the conditions that prevail, I wonder, does education as Bildung offer any resources? So I tried to think about this a few years ago. So Bildung is much more common as a theory praxis on the continent than it is in the UK. But I think Bildung is really promising in that it connects ideas of the self and self-formation and inner cultivation with culture, environment, history, genealogy in the context of better hopes for society, or broader hopes for a better society even. So Bildung is a flexible, mobile concept, and it gives, I think, an idea of a political and educational project that opposes education as commodity, teaching as service delivery, and learning as geared to instrumentality of human capital theories. So that's what I was trying to think about a few years ago, and I think there's quite a lot of work that we could do around thinking posthumanism with didactics, and I think that's quite exciting. Alongside these broad contexts are movements and projects towards localism, degrowth, and abolitionism. And all of these swirl around and intersect with posthumanism as well. But I haven't got time to talk about all of these things. But what we do need is an education which is worthy of the present. These orientations provide a social and educational context in which posthumanism has taken off as a new knowledge framework. It is, as Francesca Ferrando notes, the philosophy of our time, while Braidotti, as long ago as 2013, said, we are already living in posthuman times. But an education worthy of the present is about not being indifferent to differences. It's about having an engaged, located, and passionate stance to contest the continuing reproduction of the same old species-based inequalities and hierarchies. So, what sorts of knowledges and knowledge-making practices do we need to produce different modes of being, knowing, and doing that contest extractivism and exploitation, and that produce and enable more curiosity, more attentiveness, more relationality, and more kindness? And I think this is where posthumanism comes in. Okay, so what is posthumanism? Posthumanism is in affiliative relationship with many other posts, and some of them are named here, and I won't have got all of them, you will know others. Elizabeth St. Pierre has noted that the posts keep proliferating. And many of these posts have arisen out of traditions of critical pedagogy and the critical humanities and social sciences, and extend insights from feminism. So taken together, and I'm making a really set of broad brush statements here, the posts aim to deconstruct fixed categories and dualisms, acknowledge the impact of quantum physics, some of them do, and take account of the increased role of technology in the formation of human identity, acknowledging that we're moving towards hybridization, what Donna Haraway in 1988 called cyborg ontologies, in which humans are seen as biotechnological assemblages. Okay, feminism, feminist new materialism and posthumanism. So Francesca Ferrando in 2019 in Philosophical Posthumanism says, posthumanism is not about moving beyond humanness, but an attempt to understand what has been omitted from an anthropocentric worldview. And it is a speculation about the possible development of the human. Rosie Braidotti, and this is quite a complicated quote, so just bear with me, in 2022 says, posthuman feminism is an intergenerational exercise in desegregating the domains of knowledge production by creating connections and cultivating resonances to help create a collective we, while respecting the different perspectives and lived realities of each. And that was in feminist posthumanism. And McCormack suggests that posthuman theory creates new, imaginative ways of understanding relations between lives. So Nikki Fairchild and I tried to synthesize the key features of posthumanism in our work together when we were bringing Dorothy E. Smith's work on institutional ethnography into relation with posthumanism. And these are what we came up with. Posthumanism contests the category of the human. It shifts away from the idea of man as a sole, separate, sovereign, and egoistic individual, separated off from others by his boundaried body and cultured mind. So posthumanism diversifies ontology to include a broad range of actors, and these actors include objects, things, the built environment, matter, and materiality, as well as affective flows. And I'm just thinking, and you might be too, of this moment in this room and what it feels like to be here. This is a posthumanist space in many ways. And posthumanism recognizes that epistemology is multi-logical and that Western reason is only one way of thinking and knowing, and that other epistemologies have equal value. And posthumanism unsettles boundaries and binaries, which have been well pleased in, certainly in Western cultures. Okay. So posthumanism and feminist materialism focus on the complex materialities of bodies immersed in relations of power. There are the key shifts to do with ontology, epistemology, and subjectivity, to the extent that Karen Barad says we cannot separate those things off. Ethics, knowing, and being are intertwined, emergent, and relational. And I've listed, if you're interested, some key theorists for you to pursue. So what implications does this have for posthuman knowledge in particular? Well, I've just mentioned that knowledge cannot be disentangled from being and from doing. And Karen Barad said in 2007 in this particular book, knowing does not come from standing at a distance and representing, which is what we usually think of it as being, but rather from a direct material engagement with the world. And I've been thinking about this, to think about knowledge as a mattering, knowledge not as a fixed thing, but as a continuing enactment and processual doing. So I'm trying to play with this word knowledging to think about that. And of course, Braidotti points out that post-human knowledge is a convergence. Digital, physical, and biological boundaries are blurred. So that's a quick but quite extensive summary of post-human theory, and that is enough of that for the moment. So I wanted now to think very briefly, because I think posthumanism offers so much promise for doing things differently in education. But it's not without its problems and its critiques. And I think, we have to tangle with these. So one of the main problems with posthumanism is its white episteme. Many who work within posthumanism still remain largely located within white Euro-American scholarship. For example, the male go-to theorists most frequently cited are Deleuze and Guattari, Whitehead, Latour, and Foucault, along with Haraway, Braidotti, and Barad, or White. Posthumanism largely continues to work within Western epistemological frameworks. And Peter Hinton in 2014 argued that posthumanism and new materialism have still not sufficiently engaged with post-colonial and decolonial theories, or with critical race and migration studies. So there is work there to do. And Donna Haraway also argues that the term Anthropocene itself is elitist and most easily meaningful and usable by intellectuals in wealthy classes and regions. So I would suggest that white scholars need to engage seriously with black scholarship, and the work of Sylvia Winter is exemplary here in pointing out that anti-black ideologies manifest in the ongoing exclusion of black people from humanity. And their exclusion is foundational to the structuring of the Euro-Western concept of man. So if posthumanists, as we do, are talking about decentering man, this is often without any acknowledgement of the nature or the type of man in question. It's assumed it's a white Euro-Western man. Second thing is appropriation of indigenous ontologies. Rosiek and Snyder point out that the idea of other than human agency is actually not that new, but has received sustained development and application in indigenous studies and traditions of thought and practice. So there is ongoing work to do to ensure that posthumanism does not reproduce racialized and colonialist modes of appropriation. Another accusation is that posthumanism is theoretically difficult and hard to apply. I would probably agree with the first one, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's a bad thing. Most theory is difficult, and we owe it to ourselves to tussle with that theory and think with that theory. Being difficult is not reason enough not to engage with it, given its promise. Is it hard to apply? In my view, no. But I accept that I've been doing it for a long time. But what is needed is a willingness to take the plunge and dare to commit to doing things differently, while at the same time adopting practices of care and caution and creativity in your doings and thinkings. And that's what I'm going to move on to now. New knowledge, imaginaries, and posthumanist educational practice. So, how do we think and do education differently? What practical difference can posthumanism make? So in this section of my talk, I want to illuminate how posthumanism is being put to work in education in lively ways. This is a new field in formation, and it's unsettling and unsettled. Okay, so I'll go through a number. I think I've got 5 propositions that I want to share with you, and I'll talk about empirical examples as I go through. So, new knowledge, imaginaries. Proposition 1, posthumanist educational praxis is a mode of living the future now. And here I'm drawing on the work of Black feminist scholar Tina Kampt, who talks about the grammar of Black feminist futurity as a performance of a future that hasn't happened yet, but must. And it must because of all those contexts that I talked about at the beginning. So this is the power to imagine beyond the current fact and to envisage that which is not, but must be. It's a politics of prefiguration that involves living the future now as an imperative, as a striving for the future you want to see right now in the present. And this is not simply an expression of utopianism or of hope, but of embodied practice. It's an attempt both to imagine and to make the world otherwise. Gosh, sounds like hard work. So, how do we do this? I'm going to give you a few examples here. So, girls' camera interaction, mapping posthumanist possibilities in a diffractive analysis of camera-girl assemblages in research on gender, corporeality, and place. And this is work that Gabrielle Ivinson and E.J. Reynolds have been doing for a long time in the Welsh valleys, with girls in ex-mining towns. And I would recommend you have a look at their work. They were thinking in this particular piece of work about the camera as a specific kind of apparatus, and how that became a player in the process of emergent posthuman assemblages, which enabled the girls that who they were working with to become more than they otherwise could be. So they were not destined for particular kinds of low-grade, low-remuneration jobs, but could think differently about themselves and about their possibilities. So that's one example. Another example is from Fikile Numalo, and this is about disrupting anti-blackness in early childhood qualitative inquiry, thinking with black refusal and black futurity. And she's thinking about the world-making potential of emancipatory black futures. And she's really struggling here with how to bring together black feminist and more than human perspectives with Karen Barad's work on material discursive intra-activity, to think about human injustices such as those due to anti-blackness and settler colonialism. So that's my first proposition. My second proposition is that posthumanist educational research is and must be an experimental and immanent material practice. And here's a quote from Mirka Koro-Ljungberg, who talks about methodology as a productive onto-epistemological and political move. Methodology is not just a process. It's a creative move, a political move. And she suggests that qualitative researchers need to integrate creative and artistic experimentation into everyday scholarship so that we can become more comfortable with uncertainty and partly finished thought and practice. So that the idea here is to put normative perfection to one side so that we can open ourselves to creative experimentation. And an example of this kind of work is the work that I've been doing with the CG Collective, and we wrote this book together, which is not just a plug for the book, but I think it contains a lot of really interesting experimental work with objects like bags, string, experimentations in conference spaces. We talk about autopsy practices, and we talk about institutional spaces. So the idea here is to work against the calcification and ossification of method, to unfix method, unfix methodology, and keep knowledge on the move. And Patty Lather talks about posthumanism and feminist new materialisms as a theoretical means to imagine and accomplish an inquiry that might produce different knowledge and produce knowledge differently. Gosh, there's a long list here. It's just a list of all the people I could think of. And some of the people I could think of who are doing this kind of experimental and immanent research practice. And I'm not going to go through them. But if you're interested in pursuing these lines of inquiry with posthumanism, you might just want to take a snap of the slide and follow it up at your leisure. Okay. Third proposition. Posthumanist educational research is an ethico-onto-epistemological practice of mattering. So Karen Barad in 2012 said, we are accountable and responsible for the lively relationalities of becoming, of which we are a part. And she talked about ethics as being about mattering, as about taking account of the entangled materializations of which we are a part, including new configurations, new subjectivities, and new possibilities. And Rosie Braidotti talks about affirmative ethics as a relational ethics that assumes one gives enough of a damn about the world to look at the broader picture and try to minimize the fractures. So affirmative ethics is a refusal of self-interest and capitalist profit in favor of the values of generous, empowering flows of solidarity. This is a quote from Braidotti. This is where the collective praxis of constructing social horizons of hope and affirmation become essential. And as an example of affirmative ethics and ethico-onto-epistemological practices of mattering, with Nikki Fairchild and Karen Gravitt, we've been thinking about pedagogies of mattering, which builds on and expands the field of work on relational pedagogies. And at the centre of this is the question of who cares in higher education, and kind of unpacking the fact that care is still positioned as a gendered practice, and shifting that. How can we think of care as a relational practice, but one that's entangled with complex problematics and ambivalences? And we suggest that pedagogies of mattering offer a more inclusive and diverse account of who and what matters in higher education. And we think about curriculum, learning and teaching, assessment, and all of the practices that we use which produce differentiations and hierarchies, and think about how to unpack those and undo them, do them differently. Okay, so objects, bodies and spaces choreograph the materialities of power flows in classrooms and impact on student-staff relations, and produce visible and unknown and hidden in exclusions. So how can we be more responsible? And that's responsible, not responsibility in the traditional sense. But how can we be more responsible in a situated, with situated and partial knowledge, acknowledging our politics of location? How can we use affirmative ethics in pedagogies of mattering as a praxis of constructing positivity, thus propelling new social conditions and relations of being into action, which is a quote from Rosie Braidotti. Okay. Proposition 4. Posthumanist educational research is a practice of transdisciplinary nomadic knowledging. So this goes back to the point I've made already about the need to keep knowledge on the move, about knowledge is plural. Knowledge as a multiplicity and assemblage, as heterogeneous and rhizomic, as knowledge which is not the singularity of the canon, the truth, capital C, capital T, which is a version of mainstream knowledge and which fixes and ossifies life and livingness. And I wanted to give you this example of how I recently, with a number of colleagues, have been doing educational research as a practice of transdisciplinary nomadic knowledging. So with Hannah Hogarth, Eliane Bastos, and Elizabeth Barrett Hacking, we have been developing what we've been calling posthuman object pedagogies. Utilizing a method of noticing, we focused on 4 object encounters. And these objects were just totally mundane objects. A book, a stone, a lanyard. Many of us are wearing lanyards today, and a plastic wrapper. And we followed these objects, thinking about their agentic role as powerful producers of affects, attachments, relations, power, and differentiations. And then we pursued our objects further and thought about whiteness, colonialist legacies, and post-colonial possibilities, about life in the Anthropocene and children's learning. So posthuman object pedagogies invite nomadic thinking, and they refute the existence of the right question and the right answer, they enable us to practice experimentation. So this is another example. I've been thinking quite a lot over the past 2 or 3 years about what do doors do, and here's a whole number of questions about what doors do. Again, doors are just totally mundane things that condition and constrain our lives without our even noticing. But they are very, very powerful mechanisms of exclusion, conditioning, and control. And it's interesting that all the doors here are all closed and nobody else can come in. So doors open and doors close. And I have done various experimentations with doors in public places and in conference places. And it seems that everybody has a door story. If you're sitting there thinking about what doors couldn't you get through? What doors could you get through? How did doors enable your educational journeys to happen? Doors are really powerful material post-human objects. Okay. So my fifth and final proposition is that post-humanist educational research is a mode of quiet activism. And I get the phrase quiet activism. I wish I'd invented it, but I didn't. It was Laura Pottinger, who was doing work with on seed communities. So Laura Pottinger talks about quiet activism as the practical, tactile, everyday practices of care, generosity, and creativity. Not vocal, not noisy, not even verbal often. But quiet activism changes what it means to be activist and also to do activism. And quiet activism enables individual well-being, opportunities for subversion and social connection that transcends spatial and temporal dislocation. Slow and gentle, small, everyday, mundane, embodied acts. And Tina Kant talks about looking and listening in less likely places, in the least celebrated, most often disposable archives of bodies, spaces, and objects. And she talks about such a practice as being humble and strategic, quiet and opportunistic, but also dogged and disruptive. And one example of this that I've been working on recently, again with some colleagues from my university, some of whom are here, Sally Hewlett and Hannah Hogarth. The Get Up and Move Collective. We were called the Get Up and Move Collective because during the COVID lockdown, I sent out an invitation to a number of colleagues, would you like to get up and move? And some people did, because we were all so isolated and desk-bound and physically constrained. So we did, in our separate places and spaces, walking experimentations, data experimentations, creative writing, and thinking with theory. And it was really energizing. Okay. So, concluding. Reimagining educational research. Posthumanist education research invites us to rise to the challenge posed by Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, to work towards a momentary conjunction of forces in philosophy, art, and science, which can enable us to tear open the firmament and let in a bit of free and windy chaos. This is unsettling, but it can create new human, non-human relationalities and matterings that shift the politics and the practices of educational knowledge. So I've discussed the empirical and knowledge shifts entailed in post-humanist educational research, practice and praxis. And I summarise here some of the key ones. I think key for me is the being lured by curiosity. So much of what we do in our educational lives is reproduce the already known. What happens when we don't do that? And where would it take us if we did? And I really like François Vergès's idea of revolution as daily work. Takes me back to the idea of quiet activism. And as feminists, as feminist post-humanists, as new material feminists, we can do really, really interesting and important work in the cracks, in the gaps, in the interstices, in those odd spaces and places. So, my final slide. Posthumanism, I want to suggest, offers an expanded notion of academic citizenship which can lead to minor and major changes in our educational lives and relations, and potentially our institutions as well. So I'll end there. Thank you for listening.